This is the MeatEater podcast coming at you shirtless, severely bug-bitten, and in my case, underwearless.
We hunt the MeatEater podcast.
You can't predict anything.
The MeatEater podcast is brought to you by First Light. Whether you're checking trail cams, hanging deer stands, or scouting for elk, First Light has performance apparel to support every hunter in every environment. Check it out at firstlight.com. FIRSTLITE.com. All right, everybody, we're here with Ken Burns and Dayton Duncan. And when I say Ken Burns, I mean that Ken Burns. His first feature film came out in 1981 about the Brooklyn Bridge. Since then, he has made over 36 films. Now, in a recent conversation, you mentioned to me 30 films. But you said about. And I was surprised that someone would say about.
Well, I never count them in that weird sort of way. I know how many kids I have, but I didn't. PBS says 40 now. Oh. And it's gonna pass that in. But the funny thing,
Schneider says 36.
Listen, the most important thing is that one could be a 1 hour film, and one could be a 10-part, 19 hour film. This still counts as one. So whatever it is, it's a lot of hours.
Yeah, and but you agree, you have certitude that your first film was Brooklyn Bridge. In 1981.
Actually, PBS and an app that we have called Unum, which is sort of curating the evergreen themes that are in our film. Actually, not an app, it's a website. Unum, as in E pluribus unum, has released the film I made in college as my senior thesis at Hampshire College about Old Sturbridge Village, kind of the colonial Williamsburg of New England, which is called Working in Rural New England, and it's 1790 to 1840 kind of vibe to it. And it's all live stuff, but the last shot is a pan across a painting. Oops.
Oh, it's the birth. This is the Genesis moment.
Of the effect.
So there's 41 films. Major works on the Civil War, called The Civil War. And I want to tell you, I hadn't told you this before. You've heard this hundreds of times from thousands of people. That overtook. That consumed our family life, that film. Even to where, like, my parents bought the CD, would play the music in the house.
My children like you.
Yeah.
All four of them.
It was just like it consumed people in a way. And it created at that time, now things are so diffuse and dispersed, but it was like one of those recognized as one of those elements of sort of like a shared.
It was unifying.
Like a shared national experience, It's
pretty interesting that something that tore us in two became something that unified us in a way. I think we thought we knew about the Civil War and had kind of superficial views about it, or ideas or even mythologies that were incorrect. And this was sort of trying to tell a really deep, complicated story. And I think people wanted to know. It's the most important event in American history. And so everything that we were led up to it, and everything that we've become has issued from it. So I think there was a curiosity, no matter what idiot was making the film, that people would be drawn to where we came from. And the simplest thing I can say is that before the Civil War, when speaking about our country, we said the United States are, plural, which is grammatically correct. After the war, we said the United States is. And we still, to this day, which is wrong, these group of people is nice, is ungrammatical. So what it did is take us, people, when Lee was offered the head of the Union Army and turned it down, he said, "I cannot raise my sword against my country," by which he meant Virginia. After that, when you said your country, you meant the United States of America. And so that's just one hell of a good story. And basically the whole 11 and a half, 12 hours is how an R became an is. Didn't solve a lot of things about race, didn't solve a lot of other things, but it sure, at least for a while, made us an is.
Yeah. So also World War II, a major work on World War II called The War, the Vietnam War, also the Dust Bowl, country music, the national parks, the West, jazz, and then projects centered around pivotal American figures, including Thomas Jefferson, Mark Twain, Jackie Robinson, and currently working on, and this is where there's a little bit of surprise in here, working on a film about LBJ, working on a film about the American Revolution, which I want to ask you about. But Leonardo da Vinci,
Yeah. So
that's not America.
So when Dayton
How'd that happen?
So when I was thinking about doing Benjamin Franklin, I had dinner one night with one of his biographers, Walter Isaacson, who's a dear friend. Maybe no longer. He heard my hesitation. And Walter and I were having dinner in Washington, D.C., and all of a sudden he started to try to sell me a twofer. He said, he's this great scientist and artist, a political artist and writer. He's I think, undeniably the greatest American writer of the 18th century, and he's funny and all of this. But, and Walter had done another biography on Leonardo. And he said, same thing. You've got this guy who's this great scientist, but also this great artist. And, you should do it. I said, look, I don't do non-American topics. I only do American topics. But I walked out and was talking to one of the producing teams that produced the Central Park Five and that Jackie Robinson biography that you mentioned and the Muhammad Ali thing. And I said, Leonardo, they said, yes, let's do it. So I thought, why the hell not? Why be stuck?
Well, I'll tell you why not.
In my mid-60s,
because it's you're an American.
Wait till you see. We're halfway through editing, and it's just so exciting and riveting. And Sarah, my oldest daughter, who's that partner, and her husband David McMahon, who is the other partner, have just returned from a year with 2 of my 4 grandchildren in Florence, and what we've got is just an amazing stuff. And let's remember, it's Florentine films. So we were meant
I can see that.
Eventually to get to somebody in Florence, right? So,
well, I think there's gonna be a lot of you're gonna have to explain that probably a whole bunch.
The
of
biggest thing is the American Revolution. That's just consuming almost all of my bandwidth.
Yeah, you mentioned to me just in passing, and of course we need to get to what we're here to talk about, which is your new film, The American Buffalo. But you mentioned to me something. I wish I could remember more precisely. You said you're working on the American Revolution, and you mentioned, I think, Concord, and you said, and it's not what people think, or what is the? Because I guess it's not helpful because I can't really remember what exactly you said, but you intimated that there's a element that has become misunderstood about the American Revolution, perhaps.
Well, like the Civil War, it's less misunderstood. It's just not understood.
Okay.
And that's the work that we try to do, is a pretty deep dive that helps to sort of dissolve the arteries that are clogged with the false stories. That the Civil War wasn't about slavery. It was about slavery. There's no mention of states' rights or nullification or interposition in the South Carolina Declaration of Secession. It mentions slavery an awful lot. That's what it's about. The Ku Klux Klan are not the heroes of the post-Civil War era. That's what Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind suggests. So we begin to inherit a lot of stuff, and we think that the people who fought against the British were sturdy New England farmers and Virginia, farmers, and they left their work and their job, the Minuteman idea. And we only know Lexington and Concord. We kind of know Washington crossing the Delaware for Trenton at Christmas Day. People think it's Christmas Eve, and then that's it. And they don't know that the biggest battle of the entire thing is the Battle of Long Island or Brooklyn, where Washington makes classic mistakes. Another big mistake is Brandywine, the same mistake. Germantown, all of these stuff. Saratoga, in which Washington's not involved, is a great victory. So we want to go through the military history and get you to know. We want you to know what Guilford Courthouse was about in South Carolina, or Cowpens or Camden, all in South Carolina. We want you to know about Kings Mountain and Yorktown and the places where it's fought. It's like a 3-part opera, in New England, central states, and then South America. But it's also a much more complicated picture. It isn't just 55 white guys in Philadelphia thinking great thoughts. Right? A lot of these guys are slave owners. A lot of them are trying to get Indian land. A lot of this is about getting Indian land. And so you're now dealing with slavery, freed slaves, runaway slaves. British are offering freedom if you belong to a rebel. If you belong to somebody who's loyalist, forget it. You're still a slave, right? So there's unbelievably complicated dynamics. Women are involved from the very beginning, and any army is traveling, the American army particularly, but also the British and Hessian, have wives and children and people that are there involved in it. And you've got French and you've got German and you've got British people. Some of the British people are pro-American. Some are obviously vociferously not. There's a Canadian dimension. There's loyalists among us. At any given table, you might have 20-30% are favoring staying with the crown. A lot of people just remain neutral. So it is, our Civil War is not a civil war. There's not huge civilian deaths except in Missouri and Kansas related to the issues of the Civil War. 2 people die in Gettysburg. That's not what happens in a civil war. It's a sectional war. It is North against South. The Revolution is a bloody, violent civil war that engages all Americans, Native Americans.
When you said about Civil War, you mean that there were not a lot of non-combatant deaths.
Right.
Yeah.
People who didn't carry a rifle at that moment are tarred and feathered because they're a loyalist. I mean, we just made a film on Franklin, and Franklin's own son William was the royal governor of New Jersey, deposed, imprisoned, eventually released, presumed to go to England and get out of the thing. Instead, he starts a terrorist organization dedicated to murdering patriots because, by the way, there are lots of patriot organizations dedicated to murdering loyalists. And that means it's right within your own community. And it's from New Hampshire down to Georgia. Georgia's more loyalist, at least, in the beginning than say New Hampshire and the New England states are, particularly Massachusetts. But this changes. They start a southern strategy, beginning with Savannah and then moving to Charleston, because they presume that this loyalist population will help them pacify. That's a word from Vietnam. Pacify the countryside. Never happens. And so they kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, well, maybe we should just go up to Virginia, which is the death knell of the British attempt to keep these rebellious colonists, none of whom really know much about the other. The Carolinas do, but everybody else is pretty much an independent vassal state. Plus, to the west, there's 40 or 50 other nations, right?
Yeah.
I think we learned in doing Franklin, at least it was driven home to me, not just because Franklin and his son, but in the Revolutionary Wars, the Civil War, also because there is no state, there is probably no town in the 13 colonies that itself didn't have people on different sides.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And I remember when we were working on the West and writing about bleeding Kansas and Missouri, and at that time, the wars in Bosnia and what used to be Hungary were going on with the bloody just murders of your neighbors, and I thought, well, that is a civil war.
Yeah.
In the classic sense, that people who are neighbors and collected together, or in a location, are fighting each other.
And this applies to everybody. So the oldest functioning democracy on the continent is the Haudenosaunee, often referred to as the Iroquois Confederation, made up of first five and then 6 nations. And what the revolution does is it splits them. Some are thinking maybe we'll get a better deal with the Americans, but most of them know that they know the British from history, and they're super worried, correctly, that the whole impulse of the colonists is to move westward and take their land. In fact, our whole series begins with, we know you know how valuable our lands are. We know you want to take them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because that's what this is about.
And you're referring to the reward system.
Well,
participants...
Well,
participants on the American side were often rewarded lands.
That often, if you signed up for the duration, you got $20. If you signed up for 3 years, you got $10. But the $20 folks were also promised Indian land. But the revolution happens for really interesting reasons. One is when the British win the French and Indian War, which the rest of the world calls the 7 Years' War, they got a huge empire and they can't pay for it. They're bankrupt from the war. And so they see the settlers streaming people, English, Irish, German settlers, streaming over the Appalachians into Indian territory, and the Indians are fighting back and saying, no, you can't take our land. So they do a demarcation line and say, you can't go over the Appalachians. They go, what? I have an opportunity to own land for the first time in 1,500 years in my family's history. What are you going to do that? And oh, by the way, we're so broke, we're going to begin to tax the least taxed people on earth, the American colonists. And so this is what it is. But there's always that pressure to move across the Appalachian, and a great deal of the killing of the American Revolution takes place not just from Lexington and Concord and Boston down, to here or up to Quebec or Ticonderoga. It's all there, and we detail it, to Yorktown, down to Charleston and Savannah, and even into Mobile. But it's in upstate New York with Native people being killed and having their villages. These are not Plains Indians, nomadic people. These are people with cities and towns and farms and orchards having scorched earth policy. Washington was called by many of the Iroquois Confederation tribes the town destroyer, and they referred to the revolution as the whirlwind. It also happened in the Southeast, and it also happened in the Midwest, particularly with George Rogers Clark, he's the Attila the Hun of the story. I mean, he's out to just kill as many Indians as he can and destroy as many villages to make that area, which will later become the Northwest Territories, suitable for settling. So it's a super complicated story, and yet it engages some of the most noble aspirations of humankind, period. So that when someone came up to me and said our last film that was broadcast was called The U.S. and the Holocaust, I said, do you think after the birth of Christ, the most important event in world history is the Holocaust? I said, no, it's the birth of the United States.
Oh, that's great. I can't wait to see that one. How long will that one be?
That'll be 12 hours without a single photograph. Right? Yeah. That's the big challenge that we practiced in Franklin. I don't mean to suggest that it was easy. And Lewis and Clark, which is how you tell a story in which it's pre-photographic, no photographs, no newsreel. So
no combat footage.
No combat footage. Whenever I travel and I give a speech, I said, if anybody's got a photograph from the revolution, please, I'll give you my address right away. Yeah. Please send it in. But what happens is that necessity is a mother of invention, and so we begin to find new strategies, like going out and filming yourself, gravestones and trees and atmospherics, what Emily Dickinson called the far theatricals of day, sunrises, sunsets, and try to find new ways to do it. And it's beginning to work. We're, knock on wood, we've been editing now for several months and have, we're beginning to feel like we can exhale a little bit.
Yeah. I also want to do a better job of introducing Dayton Duncan after our preamble about the forthcoming revolutionary film, American Revolution. Dayton Duncan has written and produced many films with Ken Burns. Country music, you can help me fill in the list. Country music, Lewis and Clark, Mark Twain, The West,
Dust Bowl,
National Parks,
Horatio's
Drive, about the first car trip across the United States in 1903.
The West.
Yeah.
But also worked on Civil War, lots of different projects.
Yeah, I would, because we're friends. As I was writing books, Ken would read the books that I was working on in progress, and he'd ask me to sit in and look at films in progress, not as an expert on the topic, but it's just somebody who shares his passion for narrative storytelling. And I'd say, well, this is really working, and I was confused here. This is dragging here. Or I was, do more of this and a little less of this and that kind of thing. So I've fiddled around on the ones I didn't produce and write, but was dedicated and lucky to work with him on ones that were a particular passion or interest to me.
How'd you guys meet?
Yeah, it's a good story.
Is that through? Did you meet through Dayton's books or?
Nope. I when I decided to become a documentary filmmaker, strike one on PBS, strike two in American history, strike three, you're out. I moved from New York City to Walpole, New Hampshire, to the house I'm living in now, to the bedroom I still sleep in 44 years ago. But before that, in order to survive, we would take day jobs from the BBC who didn't want to send a union crew from New York City all the way up and incur all these expenses. And we just said, we won't charge per diems. We'll just get where you need to be in New England, which was, waking up at 1 a.m. to go be ready to shoot at 6 a.m. to finish at midnight to drive another 6 hours to get
On
back.
what kind of project?
Like one-day shoot. So one day the BBC was interviewing the governor of New Hampshire, who was active in sort of the adaptive reuse of some of the old abandoned mills, the Amoskeag Mills in Manchester, New Hampshire. And that governor was named Hugh Gallen, and his chief of staff was Dayton Duncan. So the first time I met Dayton
really?
is when
You wanted to talk to Hugh Gallen, you had to go through me.
And he had a reputation already as kind of this tough. So we did a shoot, and we sort of noticed each other, and I think he thought, oh, this child is making a film. What is he doing? But it turned out all right. And then later we'd bump into each other at sort of political events in the state. It's a small state and intimate. And then when I was getting married, I had crossed every T and dotted every I except the very important marriage license. And I needed to cut through red tape in about a day and a half. So I called my buddy Dayton. Eventually, our wives and then my children and his children became Dayton moved here, and so he gave me one of the books he did give me was Out West, which is this magnificent story of Lewis and Clark, but it's also the story of his story engaging the Lewis and Clark Trail. And I went to Dayton. I said, man, this is a really great film. We're not going to tell your story, but let's tell Lewis and Clark. And so we had some stuff in the way, like the Civil War and baseball and the West. But, one of the most satisfying parts of my professional experience has been working with Dayton, particularly on Lewis and Clark, particularly out on the road in Montana, driving from one town to another and looking and making jokes about, well, it looks like Winifred is way up there. And Dayton would say, what are you going to get when we get into town? I said, well, I think I'll start with a cold vichyssoise soup. And then I'm going to move to a salad of endive with a vinaigrette dressing. And then I will have probably either the Chateaubriand or the Dover sole. And then I hope to follow it off with a beautiful creme brulee. And then there would be a beat, and he'd say, what do you want on your cheeseburger? And so we would go into town, and we go to the cafe, and we get a delicious cheeseburger. And then I'd repeat it the other way. I would say to Dayton, well, we're coming up on, what do you think we should get? And he would elaborate thing, and then I would go, what do you want on your cheeseburger? Yep. So it was our routine. But in that time, Dayton had already known the West, but I fell in love with it, and he was the guide, and we'd be drinking Fresca and eating
I think one of the joys of my
Twizzlers.
life, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I was with you the first time that you were ever in South Dakota,
Yes.
and North Dakota,
Yes.
and maybe Montana
And
as
Montana.
well.
Oh, wow.
And the first time you ever saw any buffalo
The first
was
time
when we were filming.
Yeah, that
with Lewis
wasn't
and
in a
Clark.
zoo.
Yeah, right.
I saw a buffalo when I was a little boy, and it's either Philadelphia or Baltimore. I don't remember what zoo. And I'd already been animated as a anthropologist's sons by native people and buffaloes and stuff like that. But I saw a buffalo
At the ranch where years later the Dances with Wolves was shot.
Yeah.
Oh,
The ranch north of Pier.
Yeah.
That was the Houck Ranch at that time. I forget,
Yeah.
Triple U, I think was the name of the ranch. They had one of the largest herds in America at the time. And I'd met the rancher, when I was doing my book Out West, and interviewed him. And but then so we filmed there, and but that was what I was going to say. One of the joys of my life is on those moments with Ken, even though we're doing ridiculous hours to get up and shoot at dawn, and then drive and find the place we're going to shoot next, and go till sunset in the northern plains in the middle of the summer. So you're talking about sunrise at 4:00 and sunset at 10.
Mm-hmm.
But of just seeing it was important to me when we were making that film, of seeing his eyes so wide at the landscape.
Yeah, landscape.
Encountering the landscape of the Great Plains. And it reminded me that we needed to make sure in our film that we somehow, because we can't show the faces of Lewis and Clark and the members of the Corps of Discovery, we were standing with them looking at it and using their quotes from their journals, but to make sure we got across the sense of wonder that they had, because they came from this part of the country up in New England and the East, where basically you have vertical views through gaps in trees and stuff. And now you're in this horizontal world, and you're encountering animals that, as they would write in their journals, not known back in the United States. I mean, they're writing that when they're in Nebraska and South Dakota. They're talking about back in the States, you don't have these things that barking dogs and Piet Shans and prairie dogs, as John Ordway called them, and that's what they became, and antelope and
Prongo.
jackrabbits and and bison they knew about, but because they used to be in the East Coast, but not in those numbers and the astonishing numbers. Grizzly bears living on the plains. Elk
on the plains
was a plains animal at one time, and just this wonderland of landscape and wildlife that they encountered as the first U.S. citizens to ever go that far west, and as the first U.S. citizens, white citizens, to see in that paradise, wonderland of wildlife and landscape. And for me, that's the marker. That was what the West was after the United States had claimed it through the Louisiana Purchase, but didn't control it. But it was a view of a land and a people and animals that in the next 80 years would be irrevocably changed. And so they were the first in one respect, and they were the last in another respect to encounter that place that had been evolving for 10,000 years before the United States, as officially, was entering into it. And my book out west was about the difference between what they saw and what I saw, and to tell the history of the West in between those two
what
things.
happened between those markers.
They saw buffalo everywhere.
It'd be like going to Kenya, right, and not seeing all the things you can see in Kenya anymore, right? That there's a kind of silence and a kind of monoculture now to the prairies when it was, as they say, our Serengeti. And that's, I think we tried, I think we accomplished in Lewis and Clark, and I think again in the Buffalo film, to get a sense of just how filled the plains were with species of both flora as well as fauna, and how what it would be like to imagine or now reimagine the possibilities that there were elk, there were grizzlies, there were wolves, and so now and a variety of plant life that is just a spectacular Eden, as Dayton says, as people talked about it. This was the new territory we were acquiring, and it was just full. And then very shortly afterwards, it's not full. The sounds have disappeared.
Lewis and Clark, as I say, saw them, in just talking about buffalo, they saw them everywhere once they reached what's now South Dakota. And the plains that I crossed in the early 80s, retracing their route, it was a wildlife desert now. And to see buffalo out on a range took a lot of work. I mean, I had to, as a reporter, had to dig down to find out where can I go see some, and talk and learn a little bit about them. And so South Dakota, and then my friend became my friend through that Gerard Baker, who's in our Lewis and Clark film, and also in our National Parks film, and
also in the West film,
and also in this Buffalo film, who's a Mandan Hidatsa, the tribes that sheltered Lewis and Clark in the winter of 1804, 1805. I got to know him very well, but at one point he became the district ranger of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, the North Unit, and one of his jobs was sort of managing their buffalo herd. So through him, I got not only introduced, personally to buffalo, but more importantly, and we hope that our film gets this across, the importance that they had both for sustenance, physical sustenance, but also for spiritual sustenance for native people who had been living with them for 10,000 years. And he really got that across to me. And that's another thing we hope in this film that we make perfectly clear. You can say it, oh, they've been living with them for 10,000 years and everything, and then they were gone, and that was really devastating. That just doesn't touch it, about how intricate, whatever, how closely, thank you, their lives were intertwined, and the meaning that they had for people beyond, the food or the hides or the bones that they would use for different things. It was part of existence, and it was part of a web of being that is, you can talk about it, but having people like Gerard and other people that we interviewed in our film describe it, because they're talking about their people whose bones are out there too. Talking about how deep it was, and therefore how devastating it was, and therefore how important it is now to try to restore some more buffalo to reservations, to the land, their own ancestral lands, the buffaloes, and the ancestral lands that are left, at least, on reservations, for tribes to revive that sacred connection that they had, and also to provide them with food sovereignty as well.
It's been broken for 5-6 generations. So that's a big break, because if you think about it, it's 600 generations of experience up to that point. And then all of a sudden, we have in filmmaking a phrase called POV, which means point of view. And we tend to realize that we are susceptible to one POV, and while it might be generous enough to encompass other points of view, it does so in the kind of sometimes patronizing kind of noblesse oblige way. Well, yes, there are other views of this, but you really, in the case of this question, have to yield to those people who have 600 generations of experience, and not just 4 or 5 or 6 generations of experience with regard to this animal. And I think for us, the ability later in our professional lives to be able to cede to views not in just some sort of kind, liberal, bleeding heart way, but in a real full, we just give it over and challenge lots of things. Presumptions about ownership of land, presumptions about superiority as a species, presumptions about how you act in concert with this. Because if you're just killing a buffalo and taking the tongue, which is the first thing, you can imagine what the effect is on a culture that is using everything, as Dayton is suggesting, from the tail to the snout. And as Gerard says in our film, and also the snort, because the buffalo sounds get worked into rituals. So it isn't just using every last thing. And Dayton wrote a beautiful thing of, from the moment you're born into a warm buffalo blanket, and the time you die in a shroud of buffalo skin, all the ways in which the buffalo is used from tail to snout. And then having, as Dayton has said so well, this spiritual dimension. And so we need to actually look at the story that takes place from a variety of POVs and actually seed something, even as filmmakers, tightly in control of the narrative, is that we may not always be right or see it in a way. And how can we, in developing this narrative, see things from what is, in many cases, with regard to, say, ownership of the land or kinship with other species, entirely different point of view.
The kinship question, I think, is handled really well in the film. And again, the film releases in October?
Yes.
Yeah, called The American Buffalo. I think
October 16th and 17th.
October 16th and 17th.
Yes.
A thing that it does very convincingly, and I'd like read references of it and pondered it before, but you guys capture it really well is this idea of between the plains tribes and the animals, that there's in a spiritual dimension and otherwise, there's like this real equal footing. Meaning it was even that at one, in some belief systems, it was even at once upon a time, the buffalo were dominant over humans. But through various circumstances, the humans became dominant over buffalo. But if humans did sort of moral infractions against the animals would deprive themselves. And you had to in writing about the film later, I wrote a thing for Outside Magazine about the film, and writing about it, it'd be that bad hunting could be more than bad luck. Like bad hunting could be a sign of some moral transgression.
That's right.
Meaning you needed to make things right.
Yeah. It's sort of like an Eastern religious karma idea.
Yeah.
Right? That there was, you had a kind of responsibility. There's a reciprocity and equality between all of creation. And you needed to be in balance with that. And this is not just every tribe. It's specific tribes have specific myths about the creation and when man became dominant. But that dominance required a kind of humility in the face of what the buffalo then provided. And pre-horse, this is going to be a very big deal. This is the survival of your band, your tribe, might be on the success of one hunt that would provide you with enough meat for a month if you got 2 buffalo. And if you didn't, what were you doing? If they were not there, had you done something wrong? And it's really a wonderful question. And it's different from the steamroller effect.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's about respect. I mean, the cosmology is so different, a world view of human beings and their relationship to the natural world than what was brought to the Americas in 1492 and following, which was, we're all part of this web, and we're all, in essence, on an equal basis, everything. And it all comes from the sun, and that great unknown that the Lakotas would call the Wakantanka, the great incomprehensibility. They understood that the sun was the source of all life, and the biggest representation of the sun was the buffalo. The buffalo ate the grass that the sun made possible, and then turned that into meat that they then relied upon for their food, but also every body part for something else. And that relationship was one in which a number of the people we interviewed say in our film, the buffalo give themselves to us. That's part of how this works.
It came dancing.
And and if we don't, through our ceremonies and our practices, respect that, then they might withhold that, and they would go back to where they came from. A lot of times in sacred places to them, the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma, to the Black Hills in the northern plains for the Lakota and Cheyenne. They might go back there, and then special ceremonies and maybe the intervention of a culture hero were required to convince them, okay, we've learned our lesson. We'll start afresh here. We'll reset, and we promise, that we'll try our best not to do whatever that violation was that caused you to disappear. And to a certain extent in our film, remarkably, when the first national preserve for bison back on the plains is created in the early 1900s through Theodore Roosevelt, it was in the Wichita Mountains, where, according to the Kiowas, they had first emerged, and is where they would go when they hadn't been respected. And according to a legend told by a woman named Old Lady Horse, whose words we use in the film, she describes a girl watching the last buffalo herd after the buffalo had been slaughtered by the hide hunters, disappearing that into what's called now Mount Scott in the Wichita Mountains, and said it opened up and inside was a world of fresh beauty and the rivers ran clear and the grass was green, and that's where they went. And when they came back for the Kiowas and Comanches, it was at the Wichita Mountains where the preserve was founded. That, Theodore Roosevelt, believe me, wasn't doing it because he knew the legend of that old lady horse had told. It was just a good place. The federal government had taken some of the land from the Comanche reservation during allotment, and it made sense to do it. But there were people there, Quanah Parker and others, who understood that deeper thing and
who had interacted with the animals as young
people.
Children, and all of a sudden here they
there
are
were still
back.
some people alive that
could
remembered
remember.
the time when they covered the plains, and they were also their children who hadn't seen a buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's how dramatic that
And the
break
startling
was.
irony is that the buffalo that are going to seed the Wichita Mountains refuge
Come from the Bronx.
come from the Bronx Zoo, and they're loaded on this, in the busiest city, the biggest city in the Western Hemisphere. They're going to be loaded on these boxcars and make the reverse trip out to their, as we said, new old home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is part of trying to understand the undertow of this story. Look,
We have a very good interview in our film.
Yeah, with
that helps
what's
to
his name?
describe this.
Steve Rinella?
somebody.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that helps us get that
From the beginning of
Rather-
the
yeah.
irony. And,
rather
and
promising
what-
middle-aged man.
Yeah.
So the thing to remember is that human nature never changes. It's the same for all, right? Villains and heroes and all of that stuff that we superficially apply. So there are lots of ways of thinking and lots of ways of behaving and whatever, but native peoples are warring with one another and committing atrocities. But I think for us to be able to look and see that many of our own ancestors participated in a kind of thoughtless, which is maybe the most charitable thing you could say, thoughtless slaughter that reached a kind of industrial pitch in the last half of the 19th century that took an animal that numbered in perhaps 30 million at the beginning of the 18th century down to basically nobody could find one.
Beginning of the 1800s.
The beginning of the
19th
1800s.
century.
Yeah, beginning of the 19th century. There are at least 30 million there by the end of the 1880s. You can't find one outside of a zoo or private collections. There's some in Yellowstone. They're under tremendous threats from poachers and things like that. So how did this happen? And then why are we sitting here today not so worried about the buffalo?
Yeah. Well, I want to touch on that, and I want to touch on the slaughter, but I want to back up a little bit to ask an earlier question. You guys, in your work, you touch on the buffalo in the Dust Bowl early on and establishing, the comeuppance for tilling the Great Plains, and you have this thin, layer of grass that has a root structure that goes
Buffalo grass.
5 feet
Yep.
subsurface, right, and has this tiny reflection on the surface,
Yep.
and that ecosystem. And you touch on the animal there. You touch on the animal in Lewis and Clark.
In
The West, of course.
the national parks.
But at what point, in the back of your heads, in the front of your heads, whatever, at what point did you think, let's just go at some point, let's just tackle the animal
We've been talking about
in its
that.
own freestanding project?
We've been talking about that for more than 3 decades.
Okay.
We found a proposal from the mid-90s that was like really fully developed, and we really, were about to do it. And
Who generated the proposal?
Dayton,
you did, okay.
we were all, but we talked about it from the early 90s, about this would be a great film in and of itself. And what's so good is that this, and this happens. Some projects, you say this, country music, boom, you're suddenly in it. Other stuff, same way. And others, sit
Oh, I
there.
mean, you mean the process from conception
from
to
the first articulation of it, front of mind, back of mind. So you say something and all of a sudden you're racing towards it and you're working. It may take
country music was like that.
Yeah, it was like that. And
National parks
like that. Many of the projects, Vietnam, like that, we knew we were going to do it. It took us a long time to do the war because after the Civil War, we said no more wars. And then we had to decide that we were going to jump into that. But what was so great is that a lot of things have over the years kept kind of on the back burner or have just been there. Of course, the buffalo, it falls off lists, it comes back onto lists. You make a 10-year plan and it's not there, but then maybe there's a hole and it comes. And I'm so happy that we waited these decades to do this because I don't think we had that ability to do what I was trying to describe earlier about respecting without patronizing, without some sort of inherent paternalism, other points of view, just to literally permit them to obtain. Doesn't fit with your belief system? Okay. But that's the way the whole world works, across thousands of cultures and eons of time. And so to be able to have this little moment of daylight that we could say, okay, so after Franklin, we should be doing this, and this particular team with Dayton and with Julie and said we'll fit the buffalo in here. It was just the right time, and it feels so fortuitous. In the same way that we celebrate country music for the impulse of just saying. I mean, a friend suggested it to me in Dallas. I was kind of nervous because Dayton and I were thinking about something else. I went back to Dayton. We don't have to forget that idea, but country. And he's like, we forgot that idea. We're like, we don't remember what it is anymore. And suddenly we were just pressing forward on that. And that's okay. Some things are developed over time, and this one, like a fine wine, just needed that age.
Yeah. And I think by dealing with it in bits and pieces on those other films, even before we did some of those other films, we talked about one just on the buffalo, but we just kept saying this is it's such a portal to telling a story that's not. This is it's like in our biography series.
Yeah,
this is a biography of the American buffalo in one respect, but it's not just about the buffalo because it never was just about the buffalo. Mm-hmm. And what my friend Gerard and other people made clear to us is that if you tell the story of the American buffalo, you're also telling the story of native people, particularly on the plains. You're also telling the story that's even larger than that, which is a collision of two worldviews of how we interact with the natural world, which reached its most dramatic crescendo on the Great Plains in the latter part of the 19th century. And you're also just talking about lots of different things, the importance of, what does the railroad mean?
Mm-hmm. What does manifest destiny
mean? Manifest destiny mean? What does conservation mean? Who are the people that step forward for their own individual private reasons, sort of do-it-yourself buffalo salvation projects? 20 head here and 20 over here in New England, of all places, and some of them are doing it because and on two reservations where they're being preserved and grown for the more traditional reasons. But ranchers, Charlie Goodnight, the legendary cattleman in the Panhandle of Texas, hated buffalo, and he really didn't like Indians much. And by the end of the film, you find out that he starts raising buffalo. He becomes very attached to them, and he becomes very attached to providing buffalo to Indian tribes near him for their ceremonial reasons. And George Bird Rinella, who was a character in our film on the national parks, plays a critical role in their salvation. And some very couple people who aren't particularly likable in modern times, rightfully so. William T. Hornaday, who becomes a crusader for saving them from the commercial destruction, and who hates Indians and thinks that they're and a lot of other non-white people, and believes in the pseudoscience of eugenics. But he still is a person who played a crucial role.
Yeah, you can't overlook it.
Yeah,
yeah.
You can't overlook either of them. I mean, if we're talking about Buffalo, we can't just sort of say, well, but we're not going to talk about this other part. As Ken mentioned, our films deal with human beings who are their own amalgam of different impulses, and you have to be honest with your portrayal of it, and so without saying, well, we can't talk about him because he had this deplorable belief that there was this hierarchy of genetically driven purity of the human species. At the same time, he was, doing everything he could to keep this magnificent beast from disappearing forever. It's
there's a good the complexities of the people involved. You explore a handful of them, but there was a story in there that I wasn't familiar with. So Palo Duro Canyon. If listeners, if you're imagining the Texas Panhandle, there's a thing called a landscape feature called the Llano Estacado, the Staked Plains, and coming off of this bench are these like deeply incised canyons, and the Comanche and others had long hunted these canyons. I had never heard this story that after the animals were mostly disappeared, that I can't remember. You'll have to help me fill this in.
Quanah?
The Quanah Parker and the Comanche went to Palo Duro Canyon
from the reservation.
And they're like, if there's one place we'll find them, it's there.
Right.
And they get there, and it's being ranched
by Charlie Goodnight.
And he says, "You're not going to find any, but I know you're not going to believe me. Go take a look." And then what did he tell him? Every 2 days,
you can have a couple of my cows.
You can kill every whatever days. You can kill some number of my cows to feed on.
This is the beginning. It's
please satisfy your curiosity that they're gone.
We really love the simplistic binary idea of villains, and Hornaday fits a villain because he starts off doing one thing and he does an admirable thing, but he does it for all the wrong reasons.
And says a lot of horrible things along the way.
But then you have these other things that are the Charlie Goodnight stories, in which you have a human being who's an Indian hater, an Indian fighter, and is a buffalo hater and a buffalo killer. He wants to raise his cattle in Palo Duro Canyon. He's got the first ranch there, and his evolution ends up embracing, as Dayton said, not only the buffalo. On an accident, his wife's lonely and she wants to raise a few buffalo calves, and so they end up with a herd that's not insignificant in the story of all these isolated herds that need to, in some ways, if not coalesce, contribute to a coalescing in various places that will protect the buffalo from the pressures of real extinction. But he also then is shedding the animosity towards Native people and embracing them and he in a hugely important way. And it's those stories that punctuate all of history, regardless of subject matter, that you are drawn to as easily as you do. We have in our editing room a neon sign that says, "It's complicated." There's not a filmmaker on earth that when the scene is working, you just don't touch it. But we always are finding out new and contradictory information about something, undertow that threatens to sort of derail what was effective about that particular scene. But we always will move towards that and lean into it, because you end up realizing, as Dayton said, that nobody, we always lament there are no heroes now, but heroism is not about, the Greeks tell us, about perfection. It's about strengths and weaknesses. And so you want to calibrate and calculate what those strengths are. Achilles had his hubris and his heel to go along with all of his great strengths. So it's really not perfection. It's the negotiation between strengths and weaknesses and what happens in that. And so Hornaday remains an important person to tell. You don't wash him out. You don't cut him out of this. He's not disappeared or canceled. He's an important, really important person, but he represents a kind of heroism that is not, doesn't reach a Charlie Goodnight. You cancel him for the early years and then all of a sudden embrace. So the idea of even cancellation in good history becomes kind of beside the point. You're going to try to include as much as you can and treat everybody with that kind of perspective that allows you to understand even the motivation of the hide hunters, even the motivation of this. So you're not excusing it. It isn't some big, kumbaya moment. This is tragedy. This is violence. This is hatred. This is race animosity. This is generosity and love and purpose. There are people from all over the country who band together, and we now have buffalo not skinned in some museum, as Hornaday initially was doing, not on a damn nickel, but there's hundreds of thousands of them that are alive, and we can take our kids and our grandkids to see them, and that's one hell of a great story.
I was heartened by the bold choice to use the word buffalo in the title, and
I'll let Dayton address this.
I had dinner with Dayton last night, and I was talking about a question I had asked of. Well, I'll point this out. So there's a number of people. Well, there's a couple people that are in this new Ken Burns documentary, The American Buffalo, who have appeared on this podcast before. So we've had Dan Flores on a couple times. Michael Punk's been on a couple times. I recently interviewed Dan Flores about his new book, Wild New World. And one of the questions I asked him was, we were talking about, there are certain things that historians and writers, when they talk about them, they feel like they have to explain the evolution of the thought.
Right.
The peopling of the Americas. No one ever is comfortable saying, here's what happened. They'll say, well, for a while we thought this. Then for a while we thought that. And currently we think this. And there's certain subjects that people they feel like, I can't just say what the current thinking is. I have to say how we got to the current thinking. And we're talking about like when you use the word, if you describe the animal's buffalo, it usually comes with, you feel this need to go, hear me out, yeah. Right? Yeah. And explain the whole thing. And just in the film, they spare all that. Like it's not there. It says scientists, whatever.
You said scientists call it bison.
Known to scientists today as bison.
Right?
Yeah.
And that allows us to use it interchangeably and not
get into the whole etymology of
our argument, because it is Buffalo, New York, not Bison, New York. It's the Buffalo nickel, not the Bison nickel. It's now been changed from a Bison
Buffalo
Reserve to
Bill
the
Cody.
Buffalo. It's Buffalo Bill. I mean, you've got all these examples. So what you're acknowledging, and though Dayton I can press a button.
That's
on
a great
Dayton.
point. I'm going to steal that from you, the Bison nickel.
I mean, you can hear the whole dynamics of the argument, but it's quite simple. If that's what you're calling it, this is what we'll call it, and we will early on acknowledge that scientifically it is bison. And if you want to get into the fact that there are buffalo in Africa and buffalo in Asia, and and this is not really a buffalo, it doesn't matter. We say this is what the earliest settlers called it, or a variety of things. There's lots of Native American names for it, dozens. And sometimes, one tribe will have dozens of names for it, depending on its age and its size and its sex and its health and where it is and how much skin and, how much fur it has and what fur is lost. So, this is what we call it. And the rest becomes complicated semantics, which is designed to put people to sleep if you have to, in that meta way, sort of say, so this is how we all have to think about it. And I'm trying to save Dayton from having to
fit.
do what he does, which is it's you know it's
He said someone took him to task at a recent Q&A, and he had to do it. He had
like
to do
we
it,
were
right?
going to talk for 10 we were going to talk for 20 minutes and 19 was his explanation of what it was.
I just picture the guy raise his hand being like, but hold on a minute.
Yeah, right, exactly.
You named it the wrong thing.
You know,
Right.
So and
you're maybe you didn't know this.
Yeah.
But they're actually bison.
Yeah.
You see, there are these other, and I want. And so
the last thing you want to do with Dayton is to do that. You know, it's like Brer Rabbit. Please don't give me a lengthy explanation of. Please don't ask for a lengthy explanation of the bison buffalo controversy. And then
he brought up another instance where he toyed with one of the things, which is that
Lewis's death.
that Lewis killed himself or was murdered. And he explained to me the process of, do we get into it? How do we get into it? And eventually it's just, he killed himself.
How much of dinner did that discussion take up?
It was post dinner, so it was, but it do I really need to do this? I suppose I should do it. I said, well, actually, the way we solved it was because I was one of the interviewees on the Lewis and Clark film, is that I tell the story, and so I said, so we can have the narrator later say, well, there are some people who claim he was murdered and all that, but I'm the one that's saying it. The narrator's not, and just give them my address and my phone number, and I'd be happy to talk. And I'll be happy to, anybody wants to chide us for naming this the American buffalo instead of the American bison, and using it interchangeably with bison, to save time for this podcast.
Yeah, and to avoid redundancy.
They can contact me as long as they're paying for the 20-minute phone call.
Just think in sentences that comprise paragraphs, that comprise blocks of narration that are pages of talk, that you can't just see buffalo, 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 or bison, bison, bison. So you're saying bison, and then buffalo, and then the animal, and then bison, and then buffalo. So it just helps relieve the thing. But the point is, they're buffalo, and that's the name of our film, and we're sticking with it.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
How did you guys? This is a version of asking, how do you find your subjects for your films? But I want to focus on one that I found that I could watch all day and listen to all day, because of just the articulation, the passion. Is George Horsecapture Jr.
Yeah. So I'll let Dayton tell the story, but I think when I was trying to talk about what it might be like to cede the momentum, the impetus of your own worldviews to someone else's, not just in some kind of gracious after you, Alphonse, no, after you, Gaston, but in a real way. It occurs naturally because George Jr. does not see things the way we expect people to see things.
Oh, yeah.
And so
it's disorienting almost.
It is disorienting in the most, for me, emotional way. I have watched this film dozens and dozens of times. I have wept every time I get to his last remark, which we will not give away. And I have been watching myself agitated, disconcerted, being kind of elated that there might be another way to see this. Grasshopper, Yeah. I mean, it's like suddenly there's another way to figure out how to square the circle. And that makes me curious about it. So, he is, you could listen to him about anything because he is going to come out of it a way that just upends your own kind of whatever it might be. There's nothing wrong with wherever we come from is wherever we come from, and what we bring is okay. But it's going to be nice to have him there as, like, what do we call it now? A disruptor, right? It just but in a real sense, in a spiritual way. It's like upending conception. Like Dayton used to have this rap. We'd been on the road with the national parks, and he'd say, people would look at a river and think dam.
Mhm.
They would look at a stand of timber and think board feet. They would look at a canyon and wonder what minerals could be extracted. But couldn't you, with a national park idea, let go of that and see things in a different way? So the seeds of that impulse are part of the 600 generations history of George Horsecapture Jr., of a small, tiny tribe in north central Montana.
Mhm.
And out of his wisdom is not an argument, not a fight, not a war, but the possibility that if I sit where you're sitting, as my ancestor Robert Burns said, "Oh, would some power the gift to give us to see ourselves as others see us." George just suddenly goes, whoa, and there's just some new light that's possible. He's the bee's knees to me.
Mm-hmm. I met his father, George Horsecapture. Mm-hmm. He's George Horsecapture Jr., who was a very renowned anthropologist when we were working on the West, and spent some time with him.
When I tried to find George Horsecapture Jr. online, I read a lot about his father.
Yeah. And so I knew about him, and then I learned from friends that we have at American Prairie, the nonprofit that's trying to reintroduce buffalo and restore part of the prairie in Montana, which is not too far from the Fort Belknap reservation, that George Horsecapture Jr. was doing a program at the reservation dealing with buffalo, and would sometimes come and talk to them at American Prairie. They're their neighbors, and they work together now with American Prairie giving some of their buffalo for the Fort Belknap herd, but that he would come and talk to people that were visiting there, about what it meant, what the buffalo meant and still mean to his people. And so I said, well, I had never met him, but this is part of our process. You want to give things a chance, right? And so we obviously went to people like yourself and others, Dan Flores and other people who have written books about it, and also Dan O'Brien, who is a writer but also has a buffalo ranch in South Dakota, and Rosalind LaPierre, who's a Blackfeet Métis, but who's an ethnobotanist and historian. Michelle Nyhouse, who's a writer about extinctions and stuff. You go through all the reading you do, and you say, oh, well, let's go talk to those people that might help us tell our story. And some of those that turn out to be really good, and some of them don't. But we wanted to talk to descendants of Quanah Parker. Who's a character in our film. We learned about Marcia Pablo, whose great grandfather was Michelle Pablo, who had an important herd on the Flathead Reservation. And then I just said, well, let's spend 2 hours with George and just see what he's got to say. And interviewed him in Fort Benton, Montana, and right from the get-go, you knew this guy was bringing something that was not necessarily narrative storytelling of the historical story, but just a flat-out point of view. He's got some incredible moments in the film, including the final, but even well before that. When we're talking about the technique of the buffalo jump before the horse.
This is his debut in the film.
And we have other people, Rosalind LaPierre and Sarah Dant, who's a environmental historian, explaining how that worked, how a tribe would work communally to try to maneuver a herd and then get it moving toward what you couldn't see from the ground, is that there's a cliff on the other side. And the buffalo jumps, pishkins, as the Blackfeet would call them. And they tell that story, and it just comes alive. And then George just comes on in in the
So our
in
music,
the moment day,
our music
in the modern
is
day.
going, is pretty, it's a stampeding music, and it just sort of ends and resolves as they go over the cliff
Right.
in your imagination and in a painting.
and
But
then you're looking up on a live shot.
But we
from
see
the
a
bottom.
live shot with quiet, and then you hear this voice come on.
And he says, "You go to a buffalo jump, these days, and if people ain't talking like magpies."
So you think you're going to hear about the sorrow of the buffalo, that you can hear in a Native American way, the sadness, the sorrow, the screams of the buffalo. But he takes you in exactly the opposite direction.
Yeah, and he says, "But you get the quiet, and you think about that, and they're going to eat now. They're going to be able to eat, and that makes people happy. That my family, my tribe, we're going to have enough meat to last us, weeks, a month into the winter, and that's a good thing." And it's just like, it's like, holy smokes, it's just like, of course, they would celebrate.
Yeah.
You just got, we don't get into it in the film, but in the book I mentioned that there were certain among certain native tribes, if you didn't get all of them that went over the cliff, because they wouldn't all necessarily die going up, and they had people at the bottom to finish them off, we say that. But part of the thought was you needed to do that because otherwise the survivors would go and tell
And warn.
them.
We still
about
use that
place.
term today. It's called when they're educated.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
You don't want to educate turkeys or whatever. He has a line that really stuck with me, and he uses it so fluidly, and it's not rehearsed. But he's talking about his people, his tribe, or his collective people, Native Americans, and he says, "My people and their people." When he says their people, he's talking about the buffalo. And the thing I wrote about your film, and I touch on being in the film, and I quote him, and I wound up needing to, when I say their people, it's so disorienting. Like I said, I needed to put in parentheses,
Right.
so because the reader would never understand. When he says their people, he means the animals.
Right. But there's no parentheses in his mind.
No,
And that's the great thing about
I
him.
kept
and
writing, and I wrote it, and I'd look at it and be like, no one's going to understand what he's talking about.
Right.
But their people are like,
But
the buffalo.
But George is asking you to take the parentheses off and see things in an entirely new way, in which that word then is part of a reciprocal relationship between all of creation, and not just the dominant species and everybody else.
I couldn't make it like you can't make it work
Right.
in writing.
No, you can't.
Without a parenthesis clarifying what he's talking about by saying their people.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing with on the film. In film, when he's talking, and he'll say some things that grammatically, are confusing or something like that. But there is no confusion watching him say it.
Right.
It's totally communicated.
Yeah.
The my, into ownership.
Yeah.
The my cattle, my land, my this. He's asking you to say, there's a, who's the?
This is a response to Goodnight. I
Yeah,
believe.
this is the, the early 19th century philosopher Proudhon, I think, who said property is theft, and that was part of the developing revolutionary and all the stuff that leads to. But he has that not as an intellectual idea in opposition to anything. It's just like,
what kind of theory is this?
what does my mean? What does that mean to be my? I mean, where does this come from? This does not compute in a way. And so he's, by virtue of his clarity and his certainty, you are then required to let go for a second of your own sort of momentum, which in this case is 4 or 5 generations, 6 generations old, as opposed to his, which is 600 generations old on this continent, and say, whoa, well, maybe he's got a point here, right? And so I love being, not calcifying. I love the fact that he kind of wakes you up.
He also has a great moment, speaking of the bison nickel, the buffalo nickel, in interaction with your comments about that, about this animal that gets put on a nickel on the other side of an Indian head, by the way, but that the model for that was from
Black Diamond.
Black Diamond that you describe, and that what it's
I went to the last known
fate.
I went to the last known location of Black Diamond's head, which had become an Italian clothing boutique.
Oh my God!
Yeah, and I went in and told the woman working there, you know what used to be in here?
but as you point out, so here's this here in 1913. Here's this symbol. On one side is a portrait of a Native American.
Is that an individual's portrait? Who is that?
I think so, and I can't remember his name. Or at least I know that there are theories of who it is. It may not be known, but definitely, Fraser said this one was
Black Diamond.
Black Diamond is a, and as you say, and so what we're left with this. What is it a symbol of? It's it's a wonderful thing. And that to us comes near the end of the film is what is the buffalo a symbol of in American history? Is it a symbol of plenty? Is it a symbol of destruction? What is it? And then George comes on, and just gives it the final thing. He says, in my confusion, he says, I was thinking like he's looking at that nickel right at that moment. It just makes me, why did they put that buffalo on there? What is it? Why is it that for some people that you want to kill the thing you love?
Mm-hmm. This is it, because look what we have done. We are beginning now. This is 1913 to fetishize and to romanticize the native man and the buffalo, something we have just spent the last century trying to exterminate. Mm-hmm. And now all of a sudden it's the symbol of us. What two symbols represent the newness of America, particularly the West, then the Native American and the buffalo. And
what happened
and so
to them?
we've done this to it. To me, when he says that, do you have to kill the things you love? You just go, my God, that may be the story of mankind. I mean, there's a moment, one of the episodes in the Vietnam film, the 8th, I think, out of 10, is something a Marine said to us that we're just talking about warfare in general. And he goes, well, that's the history of the world, meaning warfare. So we just called it the history of the world because this is what human beings do.
Yeah.
This is what we do. This is not the aspect that we like to say. We want to say, oh no, we're the Mona Lisa and we're the Tower of Pisa and we're the this and the that. We're also this.
That's I've tried
that.
No, I've tried to find parallels. I mean, there are many parallels for that in minor forms. Like you could look at our most populous state, right? Their state symbol is the grizzly bear, of which they don't have any, right? So there are things like that, but it's so. And one of the comments that I have in the film is how quickly the nostalgia began. Because you guys do a great job of Buffalo Bill Cody, in the Wild West show, where they are. It's like he got on a train. It's like he got on a train from participating in the final slaughter to arrive on the East Coast to mythologize
the thing he tried to
the
get
passing.
rid of. But this is
but it was like he didn't even look different.
No. He's still advertising the same shtick.
Yeah.
He's just now flipped the coin, right? And it's different. But look at that. We romanticized the revolution. We took the Civil War and made it not about race. It was brother coming together, all of this sort of stuff. We call the Second World War the Good War. It's the worst war ever. 60 million human lives were extinguished. And it's the good war to us, right? So this is always happening in our purview, and I think what we've been dedicated to is to try to take the onus of a superficial treatment off it and just say, it is possible to tolerate complexity. It is possible to give and take away at the same time with an individual or a moment. It is possible to sit in contradiction. It's complicated, as the sign says in the editing room.
You said to me one day on the phone, you just said, nothing is binary.
Yeah, nothing's binary. Nothing is binary. And that's all we want to do. We want to make something red state or blue state, black or white, young or old, rich or poor, male or female, gay or straight, whatever it may be. We want to make sure that there's just an on-off switch for it so that we know where we stand with everything. And everything will resist that kind of on-off switch, because in Charlie Goodnight, you have all of this complication. In William T. Hornaday, all of this complication. In Theodore Roosevelt, the great conservation president who, in fact, subscribes to many of the abhorrent eugenics views of Hornaday and those that are spouting them, like Madison Grant, are also doing magnificent things. And so, Lincoln, as late as 1861, was thinking of colonizing black people to Mexico or South America or back to Africa. In 61, that's when the guns open up at Fort Sumter, right? I mean, and yet he's the great emancipator, which he is. He's the visionary who wrote the Gettysburg Address, which is our 2.0 operating manual. Declaration 1.0. Oops. The guy who says all men are created equal owns hundreds of human beings. We will gloss that over. Don't pay no attention to that man behind the plantation. So he says, no, we really do mean it. But it's complicated. It's really, really complicated. And I think we need to, as Americans, particularly today, rejoice in complication. And I think what I was trying to say before is that maybe as we got older, our chops get a little bit better, and that we find a way to rejoice,
integrate it more,
to rejoice in that complication.
Yeah.
I was going to, can I just say, in terms of these, complications and other things, you do a great job helping us in talking about how the people like Roosevelt, avid hunters, George Bird Grinnell, an avid hunter, informing the Boone and Crockett Club, helped start a movement in which hunters were at the forefront of conservation. So you can't just have all this market hunting. You can still have hunting, but it needs to be regulated and not just sort of wanton. And that's an important part of it. And Grinnell is a personal hero of mine in that respect. Who also saw conservation differently than some of the others of his age, because he also had a deep connection with Native people, was actually interested in them as human beings and everything. But you take Roosevelt, who rushed west in 1883 because he'd heard that the bison were about to be gone forever, and so he gets on a train and rushes out to what's now North Dakota.
Wants to get one.
He wants to shoot one while there's still a chance to do it, so he can hang a trophy on his wall. In the book he writes, after he buys a ranch also in that place and keeps coming back for several summers, about hunting adventures of a ranchman, he talks about the buffalo and said, their disappearance is a great tragedy. But on the other hand, not only was it necessary for the advance of what he called white civilization, it was probably a blessing that it needed to be done because of its impact on us, controlling Native people. So he just said in a book that he's written that the elimination of the bison was
good,
maybe a little bit sad,
the disappearance
but
of
it
Indian.
was a blessing and necessary. Who then with Grinnell forms the Boone and Crockett Club, who then with Grinnell helps save and enact regulations in Yellowstone to save that last remnant wild herd from being poached out of existence, who then signs the bill that creates, with a executive order, creating the first preserve for bison in on the plains, and also the one on the Flathead Reservation in northwest Montana, and as we say, the greatest conservation president in our history, without question. But he's all of those things.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with saying it's all those things. You can't just say if your tilt is, well, he said this about their extermination, he's done. Or opposite, if they just said he's just, there's only glory to be talked about with him. He was who he was. He was a complete thing. and we try to portray him in that way. He also spent, can you imagine this? He went out to Oklahoma to the Comanche reservation after Quanah Parker had appeared with some other Native leaders in his inaugural parade in 1905. He then went out to hunt coyotes, and Quanah invited him to come to his fairly elaborate house called the Star House on the reservation. And can you imagine the President of the United States going to a Indian reservation, spending the night on the porch, sleeping on the porch of one of the Indian leaders, but then told him, from what you've told me and everything, I think this is a good place for us to have the first buffalo preserve. I mean, that's a journey. I mean, I don't want to overstate it. I don't think Theodore Roosevelt's views of, the pecking order of the races, as he would call them, changed that much in terms of his opinion of Native people. But, he loved to hunt, and he loved, they were two warriors who were, Quanah Parker had his own journey.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
No one hated Texans more than he did. They abducted his mother and his little baby sister and took them away from the Comanches back to the white civilization, because that's where,
because they had been.
Yeah, if listeners
too.
Want to get listeners will get a good sense of this from the film, but also I would recommend as well Empire of the Summer Moon. If someone
absolutely
hear the story.
But anyway, Charlie Goodnight was one of the Texas Rangers who abducted Cynthia Ann Parker from the Comanches to bring her back to the Texas settlements. So Quanah was a renowned warrior, in fighting particularly Texans, but also the U.S. military. But then when he finally decided the buffalo are gone, we have to, forge a new path, became a leader of trying to help his people make that adjustment without giving up many of his traditional beliefs, including multiple wives and long hair and the use of peyote. But he became a good friend with Charlie Goodnight, and Goodnight helped Quanah get the remains of his mother and baby sister brought back from Texas and buried near the Wichita Mountains, where they had considered their home.
Known that, yeah.
And in thanks for that, Quanah gave Goodnight the Comanche lance that he had used to kill hide hunters at the Battle of Adobe Walls. Okay, so I mean, so that lance is now in my mind that not just it's what is it a symbol of? Well, it's a symbol of resistance, right? It's a symbol of friendship, and possibly some
redemption,
some measure of redemption and reconciliation. It is something,
history
of its
the
own.
world.
It has its own blood memory.
Yeah, that's right.
One thing you guys did, and Dayton, I recognize that this isn't one of the ones you wrote or produced, but you mentioned celebrating these personal evolutions and the complexities. I thought one of the most beautiful things in any of your films was at the end of the Vietnam War, which does a very, very good telling of just the deep complexity of the war and what it did to America, what it did to Vietnam. But it ends on it ends on the wall, the memorial, and narrows in on an individual who, speaking of personal change, and an individual who initially refused. He was like, I was not going to go look.
He hated the idea of the wall.
Yeah.
It was in that school. It was very contentious that it was this black gash, that it was celebrating defeat, that it was the list of the dead. It was in no way responsible for honoring what had particularly gone on, and had resisted and was adamant about not going amongst a group of people that have already gone and had everything happen. And when he began to answer the question about this, he started off with the defiance. By the end of his sentence of story, he has gone to see a friend, and he breaks down on camera because the power of it and the memory. And he would probably still say to you mentally, intellectually, I don't agree with it's this, but he was himself, more than any of the other people, proof of the power of that great work of art to transcend. I mean, Tolstoy said art is the transfer of emotion from one person to the other. We hope that our films do that we're emotional archaeologists, not just excavating dry dates and facts and events, but something other. What George Horsecapture can do. But at that moment, you take someone who is opposed and lead him in his own mind. He's just narrating what he did in some living room safely out of the thing to the monument, and he loses it. And it just tells you what the force of that thing is and how spectacular. I mean, second only to the Lincoln Memorial, which is the greatest thing ever in our republic.
My family was gone. I was between houses. I was on the second floor of the Lewis and Clark Hotel in Bozeman, Montana, looking over the parking lot, watching the end of that movie. And I thought something was wrong with me. I sat in that room and wept.
Well, we always
like to the point where I was beginning to be concerned about myself at the end of the Vietnam War.
Because we are addicted to this notion of binary, everything's good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
We build up within us reservoirs of attention based on that false premise that it's all just black and white. So catharsis is the ability, wherever it occurs, to let that release go. I know what it means. There's not a listener listening right now that doesn't know what it's like to just break down and cry. And there's really not an answer. And there is really why is it this little thing?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wasn't in Vietnam, I didn't do that. I'm here in the Lewis and Clark, but something opens up and it spills out. It's so healthy in the best sense of the word to permit that. And, the rap in Florentine films is that we kill people really well. I was so happy at the end of this film in the Buffalo. We didn't kill anybody. We saved somebody. A person. We think the Buffalo is a biography, but we also permitted somebody like George Horsecapture to do something that, for many of us, exactly the same thing happens. All of the tensions of trying to maintain the fraudulence of this binary yes-no thing, which does not exist in the universe, you get full expression there. And George just lets me just let go of a whole bunch of baggage that I just perpetually carry, put down, think I'm not going to pick up again, and then find out I'm still carrying the same stuff.
Do you feel that you have to do something on the war in Afghanistan?
I need 25 years after an event to do it.
But I think that I'd like to challenge that.
Yeah.
I don't think you do.
Well, we'll see what happens. We've got stuff through the end of this decade, and after that, it may in fact be, and it might be all the petroleum wars. It might be Iraq, first Iraq, and second Iraq, as well as Afghanistan, and try to understand them in that sort of post-colonial way, and in a global sense, and also in the deeply personal thing, particularly with Afghanistan relating to 9/11. So it's a wonderful story, and it's very, very complicated. And deserves
even the people that it's like, for me to look at, I was born the last year of active engagement in Vietnam, but I was raised around my buddies' dads are Vietnam vets.
Yes.
But I think that there are plenty of people who have lived through that 20-year war
Yeah.
who have really lost sight
Yeah.
of the evolution of mission, the evolution of the thinking there.
Yeah.
What it was in the first place, what it became, the withdrawal. I mean, God, you guys, it needs to be someone. It needs to be someone like your team to do it. And I just don't know that you need to wait a ton of time.
Yeah. Well, we always like to, Philip Graham, who owned the Washington Post, said that journalism was the first rough draft of history, which is a wonderful phrase.
Yeah.
But you also realize that nobody turns in a rough draft, right?
Yeah.
So what we like is the passage of time and the perspective that will do. I'll give you a good, but not so quick, but a pretty quick thing. If we'd done the Vietnam film 10 years after the fall of Saigon, right, in 1985, America's in a bit of a recession. We're talking about the Pacific Rim, but we don't mean us. We mean Japan, which is ascendant. Vietnam would represent the symbol of our decline, the ball and chain that we would forever carry around with us. If I'd waited 20 years till 1995, we are the sole superpower in the middle of what was then the greatest peacetime economic expansion in the history of our country. We had won the first Gulf War with one arm tied behind our back, with a coalition of dozens and dozens of countries supporting us, the beacon, the city on the hill. Vietnam would be an important story to tell, but it wouldn't be representative of any decline. You go 30 years to 25, and we're in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're bogged down. And now people are making Vietnam references. So once again, you're going, well, maybe Vietnam is more symbolic of that. So it comes out in 2017, and so we are able to look from, it's like the Bitterroot Mountains, from a lot of different peaks and a lot of different valleys to see to triangulate better what actually took place. And so after Vietnam, I was thrilled to realize when we were working, not after it, I'm looking at a map of the Ia Drang Valley and Play May, this important Hal Moore story, and we're just doing this, and we've got this kind of 3D map that we're threading through the Ia Drang Valley on, a graphic, right? And I go, I can do the Battle of Long Island, right? Right? Yeah. We're going back to the revolution. Right?
Yeah.
And people are like, what? But now we're like years deep into it. So to me, and it's still contentious. The stuff we're arguing about in the editing room among scholars about this thing that happened, it will be when this comes out, 250 years ago is just magnificent. So I'm not saying no to that.
So you like somewhere between 30 and 250.
Yeah, as an American filmmaker, I mean, we are, working on
and
Leonardo. So
right.
we're 2 centuries before that. I mean, we say in 2 different places, it'll have to be down to 1 in the Leonardo film. It would be another 450 years before anybody would be able to duplicate what he'd done, right? Or his theories of this had benefited from, he had some theories of gravity that Isaac Newton is still a century away, and Einstein is, 4 centuries away, and Newton and Einstein have calculus. He does not, and he's got some stuff on gravity. He's a painter, right? He's a painter. And it's at that point you're going, oh my God. So the perspective is pretty important to us, just because, and I think it's one of the arguments, and maybe we've said it, of the buffalo weight, is to be able to be in the age we're in now with the kind of scholarship, including yours, that helps us understand and evolve the story that we were drawn to, and said, boy, we need to do a film on just the buffalo, because it touches all the corners, as Dayton says in the film, back in the early 90s or even late 80s, right? We got to do that. But the fact that we've waited as long as we have, nothing changed except the Inter-Buffalo Tribal Council and stuff like that, and wolves released in Yellowstone, and whatever is back has happened in the last. But to be able to enjoy your and Dan Flores and so many other scholars that appear in the film, Michael Punk for sure, you begin to realize that we've got a richer, more dynamic, less binary story to handle.
Well, whatever you guys make now and in the future, I will watch it, and I will be moved by it. I will think how I would have done parts different, and I think our audience is really going to get a lot out of the American Buffalo. I think that you listeners, when you watch it, parts are going to speak to you, parts are going to challenge you. It's healthy. It's good. You're going to probably, if you know the story well, you're going to have parts where you're like, well, yeah, what about? Right? But that stuff's great, man. It's good for your brain. So,
Exactly.
yeah, I hope everybody watches it, and really want to thank you guys for coming on and giving us the time. It means a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Appreciate it.